All right, hello out there. Can you hear me? Testing, testing, one, two, three. I'm going to say hello in the chat. Please, a thumbs up, a like, a hello. Confirmation that my audio is coming through would be much appreciated because I'm going to carry on with the presentation anyway. Peter, hello. Otto, what's up, buddy? Thank you for being here. I guess that means it is working and we are good to go. Wonderful. So, welcome to Hayes Reviews. I am Nick, the creator of Hayes Reviews, and this is a new book. We're starting a new book today. We've done 3 books already, and I've just had confirmation that you can hear me, which is excellent. Hello, voluntary de-occultist. Awesome to have you here as well. So we're starting the 4th book in the series of just reading through the books. As you guys in the chat, I think, already know, but anyone else out there catching this on the replay, my contention is that the best place to learn is from books. And so I've been building up a library, and I have been deciding to make content to help people learn from books. And so we're continuing today with our series of book readings, and this is going to be Lusitania by Colin Simpson. So welcome, and let's get started. Hi, everybody. Hope you can see me now. As you may have noticed, I'm not in my usual office/library location. I am broadcasting to you today from Vietnam. Yeah, I'm on holiday, visiting family. We are back for the Lunar New Year celebrations, which is called Tết in Vietnamese. And it's a time of great feasting, much merriment, spending time with family, and reconnecting, praying to the ancestors. And just it's kind of like Asian Christmas. But instead of it being a new year, which was arbitrarily set by whoever it was that came up with the calendars, we're following the lunar calendar in this case. And so over the next few days, I'm going to be helping clean the house and cook some food and get ready to visit temples and do lots of fun stuff to celebrate the year of I believe we're going into the year of the dragon, if I'm not mistaken. So that could be relevant to some people out there who take pride in their Chinese zodiac calendars, right? The Tet Offensive, yeah, exactly. So good. We're on the topic of history already. Nice one, Peter. Otto, you're asking if I took my book cam with me. I did. You might be able to see it right here. In fact, I was going through airport security and my bag went through the scanner, and then they unpacked it and they were like, "What is this? You need to take it out of the box and we need to send it through the scanner again." And so that was a whole thing. But I made it here with the book cam in one piece, and I'm using a kind of stripped down set. I didn't bring my nice big microphone and everything, but I've got enough to make it happen. And so we've got the book cam, we've got the laptop, we've got all we need to get some book reading done. So thank you for being here, who's here live. It's very nice to have you here. And thank you to all tuning in on the replay sometime in the future, whenever that may be. Today we are kicking off the reading of Lusitania. And so before we get into the book, I thought we could do a little bit of grammar and have a look at the Wikipedia. Now, I didn't know this. I thought before I dive into the book, and I haven't read this book yet, so I'm new to it. I have no idea what it's going to be in there, but I thought I'd do a little bit of just a cursory, one-stop bit of learning at Wikipedia, our go-to source for the approved narrative, the establishment approved narrative. And what I didn't know was that Lusitania was a place. And so this was actually pretty interesting because, these ships, they don't get named accidentally. And if you kind of subscribe to maybe the more conspiratorial view of history, where things such as the Titanic and the Olympic there's a whole theory about where they switched. Was the sinking of the Titanic allowed to happen because they knew it was going to be some sort of insurance scam? These things are named for a specific reason. And so it's good to kind of find out and think about, why was Lusitania given the name that it was? And I'm sure we'll learn a little bit more about that as the book progresses. But Lusitania, the first hit on Wikipedia, is all about an ancient Iberian Roman province encompassing most of modern-day Portugal and a large portion of western Spain. Romans named the region after the Lusitanians, who were an Indo-European tribe inhabiting the lands. And so I really I like Portugal. I've been there a few times. I have some friends out there who are living off the land and doing some farming and kind of permaculture type projects out there. and it's a really great place. It's a very laid back kind of culture, nice and warm and balmy, cheap, high quality food and drinks. So I like it, and I was quite happy and interested to find out that it was previously called Lusitania. I didn't know that. But it says here, in modern parlance, Lusitania is often synonymous with Portugal. So there's a whole piece here about the origin of the name and the people, the Lusitanians. And this was quite interesting to learn about these Lusitanians, right? They established themselves in the region in the 6th century BC, but historians and archaeologists are still undecided about their ethnogenesis. So they are a little bit mysterious. Some modern authors consider them to be an indigenous people who were Celticized culturally and possibly also through intermarriage. So this Celticization was interesting to me because I'm English and my maternal heritage is Irish, and so we've certainly got some Celtic blood in the family without a doubt. And I always kind of thought of the Celts being Ireland and Scotland, and very much located around and in Britain and what is now the United Kingdom. But yeah, it turns out they got a bit further afield, possibly. So that was quite an interesting revelation. And then a good quote here from Strabo. And yet the country north of the Tagus, Lusitania, is the greatest of the Iberian nations and is the nation against which the Romans waged war for the longest times. So it sounds like this group of people were sticking it to the Romans and having lots of fights and not turning over the lands and not submitting to this vast empire, which, everybody likes the underdog. Everyone likes a kind of David versus Goliath story. So quite interesting there. There's some notable Lusitanians. One of the Pope Damascus I was a Lusitanian apparently. And so we can go over here and have a little read about the Lusitanian people themselves. And I scrolled down a little bit. There's wars, information about their wars with Rome is on here. But I had a look at the culture, and I'll just load this picture because it's pretty amazing. This is a lunula, and look at that. I mean, that is a beautiful. I don't know if it's sort of a necklace, something you hang around your neck, maybe. That's what it looks like to me. But look at the carving on it, and we got some sort of animals. Maybe that's a person with no legs. I'm not sure. And these kind of seals at the bottom here. Looks like some sort of lion or maybe a bear face in the middle. I don't know what these things are. This one's upside down. Maybe he's dead here. He's alive. It's like a dog that's alive over here, and then over here he's on his back with his legs in the air. I don't know, but there's probably, imagine what is the story behind this and what is the civilization that went into making something like this. Quite interesting and very beautiful. And we're kind of told that all the people in the past, they were Luddites and barbarians and idiots, and they didn't know the shape of the world, and they all believed in God, and they were morons because they didn't have the scientific method, and they didn't have the benefits of the Enlightenment, but they were making stuff like this, and it's beautiful. And so that was quite an interesting little picture, I thought. But we found out here that on the culture of the Lusitanians, that categorizing Lusitanian culture generally, including the language, is difficult and contentious. Some believe it was essentially a pre-Celtic Iberian culture with substantial Celtic influences, while others argue that it was an essentially Celtic culture with strong indigenous pre-Celtic influences associated with the Beaker culture. So people aren't very clear on this group of the Lusitanians, who they were. There's some maps here about the movements of Bell Beaker cultures. So some mystery around these people. In terms of religion, they worshipped various gods and had a polytheism which used animal sacrifice. And the most important god for the Lusitanians was a fellow called Endovelicus. Endovelicus. And he was the god of public health and safety. Pretty interesting. I don't know why you would have a god of public health and safety, but maybe they were dealing with scamdemics back then as well. Lusitanian mythology was heavily influenced by or related to Celtic mythology there, so there's that Celtic influence and overlap again. But yeah, information about the language, the tribes, and look at all these tribes here. All these different tribes are considered Lusitanian tribes. So they obviously had some sort of very rich culture going on, and maybe lots of overlap between these different tribes. In terms of warfare, they were considered by historians to be particularly adept at guerrilla warfare. The strongest amongst them were selected to defend the populace in mountainous sites. And here's a quote from Orosius from the 7 Books of History Against the Pagans. In a narrow pass, 300 Lusitani faced 1,000 Romans. As a result of the action, 70 of the former and 320 of the latter died. So that story right there is a kind of Spartan type story, isn't it? Fighting in the pass and being massively outnumbered, and quite interesting that it's also the number 300 as well. Isn't the film with Gerard Butler where he kicks the guy in the chest and he falls down that endless hole? Isn't that the 300? So an interesting kind of parallel there. When the victorious Lusitania retired and dispersed confidently, one of them on foot became separated and was surrounded by a detachment of pursuing cavalry. The lone warrior pierced the horse of one of the riders with his spear, and with a blow of his sword cut off the Roman's head, producing such terror among the others that they prudently retired under his arrogant and contemptuous gaze. So excellent story there. And then here is a statue of Viriatus, the Lusitanian leader during the Lusitanian War, which is 155 to 139 BCE. Look at that, though. That's a pretty impressive sculpture, actually. They kind of built it on this rock pedestal here. And it looks like, have they carved it out of this rock or kind of fused the figures to it in some fashion? I don't know. But that is pretty badass. So it sounds like these Lusitanians were kind of fighters and scrappers and warriors, and they obviously didn't take no shit from nobody. I thought it was quite interesting that they dropped in this little bit here about them practicing animal sacrifice. And if I'm not mistaken, they also said somewhere else here that they were... yes, here we go. They also sacrificed human victims, prisoners of war, by striking them under coarse blankets and observing which way they fell. They cut off the right hands of their captives, which they offered to the gods. So I mean, these times were brutal back then. If you think we live in brutal times now, I mean, we live in more kind of psychologically brutal times now, I would say. But back then it was physically brutal. You were going to wars, you were getting hands chopped off, you were getting sacrificed and whatnot. And so brutal. But I think, it made people, there were a very different caliber of people who had to deal with these sort of dangers and these sort of tribal warfares and conflicts, right? So quite interesting to learn about the Lusitanians. I had no idea that it was a place and a people. And so we get to the subject and the topic of today's book, which is the RMS Lusitania. And this it's quite an in-depth Wikipedia entry for this boat. But kind of just before we dive into that, what I was sort of thinking about after I read about the Lusitanian people and the place, they struck me as a kind of tribe that didn't want to fall in with the empire. They were fighting against the Roman Empire. They obviously didn't want to be sort of subsumed and sucked into the Roman Empire and become part of that like vast group, nation, or land. And so they have a sort of fighting spirit, and it would be this kind of like strong fighting spirit that any imperialists or any kind of people interested in creating, let's say, I don't know, a one world government would need to really get rid of and overcome. And so is it an accident that the boat, the ship, I should say, wasn't really a boat, it was a bit bigger than a boat, but is it really an accident that it ended up with this name Lusitania, named after this place where a group of people who were incredibly fighting and had a fighting spirit and did not want to be taken down and absorbed into the empire? Is it any accident that this ship was given that name and then, sacrificed? Perhaps maybe this thing was, maybe we're going to find out that this whole event was planned and this ship was marked for a kind of sacrifice in order to maybe a way to sacrifice or harm or destroy that fighting spirit, as a kind of proxy for that fighting spirit, which New World Order types and one world government types would really want to overcome and get rid of. So I think that's something to consider anyway. And quite interesting stuff to learn. So back to Wikipedia quickly. The RMS Lusitania, this is a massive article, as I just said, but a few things to pick out, which I'm sure we'll learn in the book anyway, but it's nice to go into the book with a little bit of context. It was briefly the world's largest passenger ship until the completion of the Mauretania 3 months later. She was sunk on her 202nd transatlantic crossing on the 7th of May 1915 by a German U-boat 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale in Ireland, and in that sinking, 1,199 passengers and crew died. So that's a 1 1 and a 9 and a 9. That's that's two ones and a 9. That's a 9 and two ones. You know, and an extra 9. But interestingly, how these numbers kind of appear and pop up, isn't it? So Cunard, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. I'm just going to stick with Cunard, but this is the owner. It was the Cunard line, and they used assistance from the British Admiralty to build both new ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, on the understanding that the ship would be available for military duty in a time of war. So they were kind of built in peace times with the support of the Admiralty, and the sort of caveat that if we need to send these to war, then that's what's going to happen. So was there sort of foresight, foreknowledge, foreplanning indicated in that? Might have just been a pragmatic thing, for the times. So always good to be asking these kind of questions, though. In the spring of 1915, all food imports for Germany were declared contraband. So I just highlighted this because this is kind of a little context. The Royal Navy had blockaded Germany at the start of the First World War. The UK had declared the North Sea a war zone in the autumn of 1914 and mined the approaches. And then all food imports for Germany were declared contraband. That's kind of this method of sanctions, isn't it? And sort of trying to cut off the supply lines to the enemy or who you've declared as the enemy. And so that's a bit of a dick move because people need to eat even if even if you're fighting against them. It's a bit of a dick move. In response, Germany had declared the seas around the United Kingdom a war zone too, and German submarine warfare was intensifying in the Atlantic. When RMS Lusitania left New York for Britain on the 1st of May 1915, the German embassy in the United States placed 50 newspaper advertisements warning people of the dangers of sailing on Lusitania. So that's quite interesting, right? The German embassy was trying to warn people not to go on there. So certainly suggests there's some foreknowledge. Maybe they knew they were planning to attack it, but what kind of evil people warn you of their attack way ahead in advance so that they can prevent, people being killed in that attack. So I thought that was quite an interesting tidbit there as well. And then this is details about the explosion and how it was hit. It was hit by a single torpedo. And then there was a second internal explosion which caused the ship to sink in 18 minutes. Now, if you see the size of this thing, for that thing to go, I mean, you've seen the film Titanic, right? And that thing took like 2 hours to sink. This thing went down in 18 minutes. Incredible speed and timing. It's almost like, I don't know, buildings falling into their own footprint in a matter of seconds, isn't it? And the sinking shifted public opinion in the United States against Germany and was one of the factors in the declaration of war nearly 2 years later. After the First World War, successive British governments maintained that there were no munitions apart from... Oh, I've just got a message from OBS saying disconnected, reconnecting. Are you still out there? I'll just send a little message in the chat. Reconnection successful. Okay, good. Sounds like we're all right. Apologies if there was some sort of interruption in the video there. But that's a bit of the context about what we're going to be sort of learning more about in greater detail from Colin Simpson in his book. So with that little intro done and wrapped up, let's go over to my book cam, which I did indeed bring all the way to Vietnam with me in my backpack. And it wasn't too bad actually. It was quite compact. It wasn't too heavy. This is the size of the box that it was in, and that's an Okio Labs Okio Cam W1, 13 megapixel camera. I'm really enjoying it so far. It's definitely serving the purpose that I need, and so I'm happy with it. I could endorse that product so far, but I haven't been using it for very long, so I haven't got like the long-term data there. But anyway. It's here with me, and I'm here with you, and we're going to get into the Lusitania. Let me just adjust myself a bit. So, Lusitania by Colin Simpson. This is a little paperback book, actually, and quite interestingly, on the bottom here, you can see in the United Kingdom it was 50 pence when it first came out. 50 pence. That's a bargain. That's nothing. most new books nowadays cost between like 20 and 30 quid, especially if you want to get a hardback in Waterstones or something. But this is 50 pence, Colin Simpson. And we'll go to the inside and we can learn a little bit about the man Colin himself. I don't think he was related to Homer and Bart. It says Colin Simpson was born in 1931 and was educated at Wellington, Oxford, Sandhurst and the University of Helsinki. At the last he read Finnish languages and took a doctorate for a study of the relationship of the environment and a nation's art. He has been a special correspondent of the Sunday Times and is the co-author with Philip Knightley of The Secret Lives of Lawrence of Arabia. He is married and has 3 children and lives in Surrey. And I actually picked up The Secret Lives of Lawrence of Arabia in a bookshop in a town near me. I was really happy to find that. So I have that. We can go into that sometime as well. Lawrence of Arabia was a very interesting fellow. But yeah, Colin Simpson. So quite, if he's a correspondent for the Sunday Times, that's pretty mainstream. That's kind of insider establishment type stuff, but it doesn't mean necessarily he was part of the propaganda effort. It could be that he was at very low level in the Sunday Times and he did a little bit of work before he realized how, what the function of these kind of mainstream newspapers really is, and maybe he got out and decided to publish his books independently so he wouldn't be sort of beholden to that censorship or control over his output, let's say. So that's a little bit of info about Colin Simpson. The book itself was first published in 1972, and then this Penguin version was 1974. So I'm hoping, so it's not a first edition, but I'm hoping there wasn't any changes or alterations, between the two. There's no reason to think there was, but you never know. I always prefer to get a first edition, whether it's paperback or hardback, just because, the first effort when it was put out, there's less chance of it being messed with. But contents, we got the introduction, and the Lusitania starts on page 20, and then the actual Lusitania itself doesn't seem to be in chapters. so I don't know how we're going to break this up. It just says Lusitania page 20, and then 230 pages later is the acknowledgements. But hopefully it's broken up into chapters, so it'll give us some opportunity to pause and find natural resting places to break this up a bit, because there's an interesting bit here, which is the key to the Admiral V Code Series 1, used in signals to and from the Lusitania on her last voyage. The message is obtained by running on all the groups of letters and continuously subtracting 41,513 from the number of a letter's position in the alphabet. For example, and then we got let's see, zoom in there, you can have an example. So this is the kind of code breaking that was going on. You got the numbers across the top, and they would become a letter's position, and then you subtract that number from the number of the letter's position in the alphabet to get the actual code. So pretty complex stuff. Probably not as complex as later stuff, World War II, Bletchley Park type codes, but still interesting nevertheless. All right, so let's get into it. We'll start reading the introduction. Colin Simpson. I'll just check the chat quickly. Hey, how's it going? Dave, alien scientist, welcome. Moselle, hello. Good to have you here. Gwen, what's up? Welcome back. Frank Lennon as well. Hello. Yeah, come back. You can catch the intro. We just did a little bit on Wikipedia, but catch it on the replay. No worries. All right, let's get into the introduction and find out what it's all about. What did Colin Simpson discover? How's the lighting? Is that okay? Okay, hopefully the text is clear there and you can follow along with me. So, introduction. The old head of Kinsale is a steep and rocky promontory which juts aggressively into the Atlantic from the southwest coast of Ireland. On its crest are a lighthouse, a coast guard station, and the ruins of an early Celtic settlement. For 2,000 years it has been a vantage point for those on shore and a familiar and essential landmark to those at sea. Behind it lies a deep and secure harbour, once the shelter of Spanish and English fleets and the town of Kinsale, today a sleepy fishing port swollen each summer by the tourist and the yachtsman. There is little to do but talk, and any conversation eventually turns to the Lusitania, torpedoed nearby on the 7th of May 1915, with a loss of 1,201 lives. So that's interesting. Right there we've got a discrepancy from the Wikipedia article, which was saying there was 1,000 199, was it? So that's quite interesting. I wonder why there's a difference in the death toll. There is a Lusitania bar, a Lusitania grill, and the inevitable Lusitania souvenirs. Equally inevitable is the Lusitania legend that the great liner was loaded with bullion, which is there for the taking for anyone sufficiently rich and determined to risk diving 300 feet to the granite and current-swept bottom of the Atlantic, 12 miles south and 2 points west of the Old Head. There have been several attempts at salvage. Each has been abandoned, 2 of them ending in bankruptcy. Shortly after the end of the last war, the Royal Navy salvage ship Reclaim moored over the wreck. Her presence was recorded in the log of the Coast Guard station up on the Old Head. Speculation died when the Reclaim sailed away. In 1954, a Southampton company, Risdon Beasley Limited, moored a recovery vessel over the wreck and stayed there some days. No confirmation could be obtained by journalists that they had ever been there. The tales of bullion swelled to include a cargo of platinum and strong rooms packed with diamonds and precious stones. There followed a series of diving ventures by an American diver, John Light, who, with little money and scanty equipment, made numerous descents. His most newsworthy attempt was described in the American Sports Illustrated on the 24th of December, 1962. The team on the bottom included Surgeon Commander John Quadro of the United States Navy. Their report was inconclusive, but claimed to have found evidence that previous divers had been cutting and blasting at the hulk, whilst Commander Aquado stated he had seen what he thought was a gun barrel. As a result, the finance was found for an expensive series of dives. Ill luck and differences of opinion led to the abandonment of the project, and financial support was withdrawn. The ownership of the wreck and the cargo is now involved, and there have not been any significant diving operations since 1965. I read the report in Sports Illustrated, and at the suggestion of William Rees-Mogg, now the editor of the Times, began to make my own inquiries. That's interesting, that last name, Rees-Mogg. That's one that will be very familiar to people living in England, and I wonder if there's got to be some family tie there between Jacob and William, hasn't there? Editor of the Times, surely. Since I have no taste for diving in the Atlantic, these concentrated on the archives. The story they reveal is told in this book. From the beginning, my appetite was whetted by the doubts whether the ships of the Admiralty and Messrs. Risdon Beasley had ever been to the wreck. Working from the Navy lists, I traced 2 members of the crew of the Reclaim and have spoken at length to them. Both freely admitted that they had been to the Lusitania, but they also very properly said that they could not say anything else without permission from the Admiralty, pleading in justification that they were subject to the Official Secrets Act. To this day, the Admiralty deny that the Reclaim or any other naval vessel has been to the site, or that any Royal Navy personnel have dived to the wreck. This has been their attitude for the last 7 years. In January 1972, Messrs. Risdon Beasley of Southampton conceded to me that they had been twice to the diving site, but only for the fun of it. Their managing director has asked me to state that no employees of this company have dived to the Lusitania. My first inquiries stemmed from the idea that here was a classic tale of sunken treasure, and because of this I accepted the undoubted reluctance of many people to discuss the matter. Nevertheless, I found it a valid challenge to try and discover the facts of the story. The obvious starting point was to discover the manifest of the cargo with which the Lusitania sailed from New York. The files of the Times showed that there had been a Board of Trade inquiry into her loss 6 weeks after the disaster. A second inquiry took place in New York in 1918. At each, the manifest would have been a formal exhibit. The Board of Trade eventually receives copies of the manifests of all ships, which are stored in the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. If a ship sailed from New York, a further manifest should be in the archive of the New York Customs. The first 3 were located. All 3 were different. The one thing they showed in common was no mention of bullion, specie, or anything else sufficiently valuable to merit an expensive salvage operation. The Cunard Company confirmed that they too had a manifest. This was equally devoid of hints of treasure, but again it was different from the others. A detailed examination showed that all of them were copies. The problem was, where was the original? It was found amongst the private papers of the late President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and I obtained a copy. That discovery and the circumstances as to how and why President Roosevelt had obtained it proved the starting point of this book. I did not tell either the Admiralty or the US State Department that I had it, but asked them for access to all their records relating to the Lusitania. They quickly and courteously gave me their permission. The records of the Admiralty are kept secret for 30 years. They are then screened for matters affecting national security, and those which pass this sieve are placed in the Public Record Office, where they are open for public inspection. In the United States, a similar process is followed, the edited records being placed in the National Archives. Both sets of archives, though the Lusitania affair closely concerned both nations and was the first and most dramatic of the events which led to the eventual entry of the United States into the First World War, contain meagre information. There are substantial differences of fact in the two sets of papers, and in many cases it is difficult to accept that the files relate to the same vessel. However, the two collections of documents both agree in their conclusions. These form the basis of the official or authorized version of the Lusitania affair, which was published as a small booklet by the Cunard Company in October 1915. Stripped of its bellicose statements, it accurately reflects the public beliefs of the British Admiralty and the American State Department as to what did happen and why, a belief that they share to this day. It would be unjust to both these august institutions not to quote from it. So I think this next bit is that quote. Ever since 1840, the Cunard Steamship Company Limited has been intimately associated with the British government. From time to time, there have been several important agreements, not the least being that entered into in 1902, when the company arranged to build two large steamers to hold at the disposal of the government the whole of its fleet, and to remain a purely British undertaking. The outcome of this agreement was the building of the world-famous ocean leviathans, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. The actual construction of the Lusitania was commenced in September 1904. She was launched on June the 7th, 1906, just 14 months, 3 weeks from the laying of her keel. During the whole period of construction, her progress was eagerly watched by all interested in shipping, the vessel having aroused, by reason of her size, her magnificent accommodation, her speed, and turbine engine, worldwide attention. On September the 7th, 1907, the Lusitania sailed from Liverpool to New York on her maiden voyage, and it is no exaggeration to say that never before had such widespread interest been taken in the first sailing of any liner. Fully 200,000 people witnessed her departure. The cheering of the vast crowds, supplemented by the steam whistles and sirens of all the shipping in the river at the time, as the Leviathan moved from the stage and slowly disappeared into the darkness, made this epoch-marking event a most memorable one. These enthusiastic scenes were renewed at Queenstown, which port she left a few minutes after noon on the following day. Her reception on the other side of the Atlantic was just as hearty, a whole fleet of tugs and pleasure steamers greeting her as she entered the newly dredged Ambrose Channel. From the first, the Lusitania became a great favourite with Atlantic travellers, and no wonder, for in addition to her speed, she was so luxuriously appointed that her passenger accommodation was the acme of comfort, and well merited the description of a floating palace. Her decorative and architectural features, compared with those of the world's finest hotels, lofty domes, fashioned and painted by expert decorators. I guess that's supposed to say expert decorators. Panels prepared by skilled workers, handsome tapestries, curtains and carpets. The first-class dining saloon was a vision in white and gold. The style was Louis XVI, and the predominating colour was vieux rose. The magnificent mahogany sideboard with its gilt metal ornaments was the admiration of all who saw it, while high above towered the wonderful dome with painted panels after Boucher. The lounge was decorated in late Georgian period, and the fine inlaid mahogany panels, richly modelled dome ceiling, and marble mantelpieces constituted a luxurious ensemble. Harmony and refinement was the motif of the writing room, library, and smoke room. In addition to these various public rooms, there were regal suites comprising dining room, drawing room, two bedrooms, bath and toilet rooms, with adjoining rooms for maid or valet. The accommodation for second-class passengers was also upon a luxurious scale, and the public rooms included dining room, smoking room, library, and lounge. Ample provision had also been made for those travelling third class. Such, in brief, is a description of the passenger appointments of the Lusitania. As to her achievements and the many interesting facts concerning her 201 successful trips across the Atlantic, a great deal can be written, but space will only allow of a short resume. On her second westbound trip, she averaged 24 knots and reduced the passage between Liverpool and New York to well under 5 days. 4 days, 19 hours and 52 minutes to be precise. And logged 617 knots for the highest day's run. Incidentally bringing back to the British mercantile service the blue riband of the Atlantic, having wrested it from the German liners Kronprinz Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Kronprinzessin Cecilia. I'm not sure what the blue ribbon of the Atlantic is. It'd be good to find that out. And now we come to the last phase of her career. Although the war broke out in August 1914, and the British government, according to its agreement with the company in 1902, could have requisitioned the Lusitania, she was never actually in government service, but maintained her regular place amongst Cunard sailings. In April 1915, she left Liverpool for New York on her 101st voyage, having then crossed the Atlantic 200 times. She arrived at the American port safely, although on a previous voyage she avoided the attack of an enemy submarine. On May the 1st, the Lusitania left New York for Liverpool. Prior to the sailing, threatening statements were published in the American press by German authorities foretelling the sinking of the liner. But in the words of Lord Mersey, who subsequently conducted the inquiry into the loss of the vessel, quote, "So far from affording any excuse, the threats serve only to aggravate the crime, making it plain that the intention to commit it was deliberately formed, and the crime itself planned before the ship sailed." End quote. On the 7th of May, an uneventful voyage, the Irish coast was sighted, and at 2:10 p.m. the liner was within 8 to 10 miles of the Old Head at Kinsale. Without the slightest warning, the wake of a torpedo from a German submarine was seen approaching the ship, and she was struck between the third and fourth funnels. There was evidence that a second, and perhaps a third torpedo was fired, and the great ship sank within 20 minutes. It is impossible to satisfactorily draw a pen picture of the heart-rending scenes which followed. Men, women, and children, caught like rats in a trap, were vainly fighting for their lives amongst wreckage of every description. The doomed liner's SOS was answered within a few hours of the call, and 764 lives were saved. Still, the Hunnish pirates had performed their task, proving to the civilized world that the whole gamut of barbarism had been exhausted in the interest of German Kultur. The Belgian atrocities, poisoning of wells, and asphyxiating gases, all these dwarfed to insignificance in the face of the foulest act of wilful murder ever committed on the high seas. The crime, which will forever remain a blot upon the history of a civilized nation, resulted in the loss of 1,198 innocent and unoffending people. And there's a little asterisk here, footnote, which says, Cunard's figures innocently omitted 3 persons in the cells, as explained in Chapter 9. Ah, okay. So maybe this is... maybe there were some prisoners on board, and they thought they weren't worth counting. As the lifeless bodies of men, women, and harmless children were brought in, the scenes were most horrifying and brought tears to the eyes of the most callous people. The burial of the victims took place at the Old Church Cemetery. This appalling crime was contrary to international law and conventions of all civilized nations, and we therefore charge the owners of the submarine, the German Emperor, and the government of Germany, under whose orders they acted, with the crime of willful and wholesale murder. This was the verdict of the coroner's jury at the inquest held upon the victims at Kinsale. A terrible indictment, one which will pass into history and put to shame all future generations of the German race. This greatest outrage against humanity shocked the whole world, yet, with joyful pride we contemplate this latest deed of our navy, was the phrase used by the Kölnische Volkszeitung in an article dealing with the crime. The victory was hailed by shouts of delight in every quarter of the German Empire, and the schoolchildren were even granted a holiday. It was only to be expected that the enemy would attempt to justify his heinous work by proclaiming that the vessel was armed. By wireless and through his own newspapers, the enemy made this foul and diabolical charge. This was proved to be totally unfounded, another German lie exposed. But not satisfied with his rejoicings over such an act of treachery, the enemy had, perforce, to strike a medal with the object of keeping alive in German hearts this deed of his navy. When the British press gave publicity to this morbid souvenir, its issue was at first denied by the German press. The Kölnische Volkszeitung was very indignant at the suggestion that German artists could ever produce such a vulgar thing, but it has had to admit that such a medal was struck and that it was distributed throughout Germany. It was designed by Herr K. Goetz of Munich, is 2.5 inches in diameter, made of copper-coloured metal, and is in high relief. Even the German Press Bureau now admits that the medal was privately executed. The following is a short description of the medal. On the obverse, under the legend No Contraband, kein Banwehr, there is a representation of the Lusitania sinking. The designer has put in guns, armoured cars and aeroplanes, but has conveniently omitted to put in the women and children which the world knew she did carry. On the reverse, under the legend Business Above All, the figure of death is shown at the booking office, giving out tickets to passengers who refuse to attend to the warning against submarines given by a German. This picture seeks apparently to propound the theory that if a murderer warns his victim of his intention, the guilt of the crime will rest on the victim, not with the murderer. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? It sounds like the sort of Satanist gaining of tacit consent by revealing plans ahead of time, and then when nobody pipes up to say, hey, don't do that, that's them consenting to having it done to them. So that's a pretty interesting parallel there too. The Lusitania today lies at the bottom of the sea. Her name will be a lasting monument to the atrocities of a race steeped in savagery, and whose lust for blood knew no bounds. The reference to the medal intrigued me. So I think this is Colin this is Colin's writing again. The reference to the medal intrigued me. I quickly discovered that Herr Goetz had indeed designed one and had circulated a total of 44 examples. He had intended it to be satirical comment on the allegations by the German government that the Lusitania carried contraband. The first British publicity about the medal came in a press release from the Foreign Office to the Times. Checking the Foreign Office records for that date, it appears that 300,044 medals were cast, in different states and in different metals, 300,000 of them on the instructions of Captain Reginald Hall, the Director of British Naval Intelligence during the First World War. Their maker was not Herr Goetz, but Mr. Gordon Selfridge, the department store owner, and they had been distributed throughout the world in an effort to whip up distaste for Germany. The project presumably had a distinct propaganda value and cost the patriotic Mr. Selfridge several £1,000s. Selfridge, and this is a crazy tangent, but the last reading I did, no, the last Hayes Reviews Lives episode I did, we were looking at this. I forget her name now. She was a businesswoman, and she had a Wonder Bra business, and she was awarded an MBE, and it was for services rendered to the lingerie industry, and she was given the status of life peer in the House of Lords here in the UK sort of parliamentary system. And she was just a kind of nobody from Glasgow, working class family, who at the age of 22 lost her job and managed to get like a Wonder Bra type product placed in Selfridges, which is a massive department store. And it was just such a strange story, origin story, kind of akin to, they just invented this thing, this amazing technology in their garage, and it changed the world. So it's interesting here to see Selfridge pop up again, because there was really no indication as to why this woman I forget her name now, but why she'd been given a life membership to the House of Lords and all this other stuff. She was involved in the PPE scandal during the great scam of 2020, where massive amounts, multi-million pound contracts were given out for this PPE, and it's just ended up it's just been chucked in a field. It's not being used, and now they're burning it to get rid of it. But anyway, Selfridges, and a very interesting story about anti-German propaganda in the case of these medals. The Foreign Office medal file contained cross-references to numerous other records, and these in turn produced sufficient evidence to convince me that the official version of the Lusitania disaster contained substantial omissions and inaccuracies. These I listed and showed to Lord Mancroft, who was a member of the Bar Council, a former parliamentary secretary for the Ministry of Defence and cabinet minister, and, at the time I met him, the deputy chairman of the Cunard Company. Lord Mancroft, in this latter capacity, authorised me to search wherever I wished among Cunard's archives, and instructed certain of his executives and the company's solicitors to give me every assistance. Lastly, he authorised the quotation of any records that I wished to use. Without his initiative and assistance, this story could not have been told. Good man, Lord Mancroft. Lord Mancroft introduced me to... If anyone knows how to pronounce this word here, is it Messrs? Is it Messieurs? Misters? I don't know if there's a proper way to pronounce it. For now, I'm just going to have to keep saying Messrs. Messrs Hill, Dickinson and Co. of Liverpool and London, and in particular to their senior partner, Mr. Robert Leslie Adam. Messrs Hill, Dickinson have been solicitors to the Cunard Steamship Company Limited since its formation in 1878, and to its predecessors since Mr. Samuel Cunard founded the Cunard Line in 1840. Mr. Adam is the son of Mr. R.A. Adam, a former superintendent engineer of Cunard, who would have sailed on the Lusitania on her last voyage had he not been suffering from pneumonia at the time. I bet a man has never been so glad to have been suffering from pneumonia in the history of humanity. I bet he hated it at the time, but, you know, he was glad afterwards. Mr. Adam was, therefore, born and brought up in a world in which the loss of the Lusitania was an ever-present memory. He and his firm are the custodians of many of the facts and several of the archives on which this book is based, and, with the permission of the board of Cunard Co., he has made all such facts and records available to me, and his firm has charted the course of the Lusitania as far as this is possible today on the available evidence and with modern charts. Sifting the accumulated archives and memories of 57 years leads to error and sometimes to direct untruth. In an emotive story such as this, a degree of imbalance can creep in, which time and pride compound. To correct this account, as far as the Cunard Company are concerned, I asked Mr. Adam to read a proof version of this book on the understanding that I would correct any facts which he knew to be either inaccurate or untrue. He has done this, and though in this respect my story could not have a better imprimatur, the opinions expressed and the conclusions drawn are entirely my own. As Lawyers Hill, Dickinson's main function at the time was to prepare and conduct Cunard's defence before the Board of Trade Inquiry conducted by Lord Mersey during June 1915, and later in the New York District Court during 1918 before Judge Julius B. Meyer. Both judges kept their judgment notes, together with the originals of the court shorthand writers' transcripts and many of the exhibits which were used in evidence. The present Lord Mersey has given me full access to his grandfather's papers. Certain of his grandfather's actions may appear to be unjudicial. It is important to state that this was because he had been ordered to act as he did. He was also told to return to the Admiralty all papers relating to their evidence. To his credit, he eventually disobeyed his instructions and preserved his papers, doubtless with the idea that one day his conduct would be explained. So he was doing a bit of a whistleblower function there. So he was getting orders to hand this information, this evidence over, and he ignored that order. So good on him, because it's always the order followers that get us into the stickiest of situations. So yeah, good on him for having a bit of foresight and a bit of moral integrity there. The papers of Judge Meyer were embargoed for 50 years, wow, and the U.S. Department of Justice released them for examination in May 1968. The archives of both judges show that they were in close contact with many persons charged with the conduct of the war. In every case, I have tried to follow up these contacts, and the list of private papers and sources I have used is given in the sources. The sum of these inquiries added to the Cunard and Hill Dickinson archives, was finally complemented by the discovery of the papers of the then chairman of Cunard, Alfred Booth, and his cousin George, who was Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Munitions from 1914 to 1919. Finally, this book does not raise the matter of the ethics of unrestricted submarine warfare. In fact, it does not discuss ethics at all. However, it is relevant to recall that history tells that the first U-boat war was the brainchild of the German Admiral von Tirpitz, and that deputizing for St. George against the German Dragon was Admiral of the Fleet Lord Fisher. It does not tell that these two men corresponded in secret. On 29th of March 1916, while the recruiting posters still shrilled, "Avenge the Lusitania," Lord Fisher wrote to Tirpitz, quote, "I don't blame you for the submarine business. I'd have done exactly the same myself." Ooh, wow. What do you think of that as an introduction? That is so intriguing and so full of juicy little nuggets that I want to learn more about. One of the main ones was these, this what do they call it? Like a manifest, the list of what was on the boat, and the President Roosevelt having a copy, and they were all different. That's very intriguing. And this, what I love about this book, and so what was this, what would we say, 1972? Yeah, what I love about this time in history and books that are a little older like this is he couldn't go onto Wikipedia and look stuff up. He had to he had to actually get off his ass and do some digging around. He might have to grease the wheels. He might be bribing people or lying to get his eyes on different, documents and paper records. And you actually had to be good at stuff. You had to have a set of skills. You didn't just type into Google or, Alexa, what is the, who sunk the Lusitania? It's like, I just have such a deep admiration for people who wrote books back before the internet because of the amount of effort and the dedication and the focus and the determination that you would have to do to get even just a modest little, what's this, 300 page book. So 300 pages, but it's kind of a small little paperback, 300 pages. But just imagine the hours and the time and the effort and the networking and all that went into it. It's just unbelievable. So it's great that he's providing us with the list of. So we've got some notes in the back. So you see, I put a little green sticky tab there, and that is where the notes begin. It's like I would say the last sort of sixth or fifth of the book. We got notes, then we got like a whole section on sources, and then an index. So it's got everything you need. I hate it when I get books and they don't have indexes or sources or notes at the end. So what did you think of that? I'll have a little look at the comments now. Any interesting tidbits pop up for you guys there? All right. Let's see. What did I get up to? Oh, voluntary deoccultist. Give me a target with a arrow right in the middle there. That's good. Cleopatra, hello. Good evening. Messier. So Peter Estrada, Areai. If it is spelt Messier, then maybe Messier. Yeah, Messier. So yeah, I have no idea. Messier. I was thinking it might be Monsieurs, but I don't know why you would be using the French sort of honorific there. Voluntary Deoccultist says, I'm making awesome comments that you agree with. I'm very happy to hear that. I'm glad you're enjoying the video. Peter says, the plot thickens before it started. Yeah, that's what it's like, isn't it? It's already so interesting, and that was just the introduction. Peter Estrada says, Wiki is too unreliable. Got to go as much primary sources as possible. Yeah, totally agree. This is why we like the books. This is why we want to get the old books, the ones that are kind of, like you can see on the top here. Well, I don't know if you can see actually, but you can see all the kind of patching, all the sort of moldy patches that have come up because it's an old paperback, but all the staining as well on the inside of the pages there. But these are incredible artifacts at this point in history. I'm always saying that. So let us carry on. No, that's the wrong one. So let's get into it. Let's see. So it is in chapters. That's a relief. I thought it was just going to be one continuous text, but we'll do another chapter and then we'll kind of see what we learn and where we're at. Because so far, I think at least we can we can rest assured that Colin's dug up something juicy and interesting. He's found some interesting threads to pull on, and he's going to really dig into this to find out what actually happened and what was going on, because there's a lot of conflicting stuff. There's sort of signs of a cover-up with the manifests being copied, and then with them not matching, with the 50-year embargo put on the notes from the judges. The fact that all these dives have gone down there and not found anything and not come back and run out of money, so maybe there's some sabotage going on to prevent these divers getting down there and finding what's at the bottom of the ocean, and the sort of the secret communications between the British admiral and the German admiral, and that actually reminds me of the film the Snowpiercer. I won't say any more because it might spoil it, but you might be able to kind of put two and two together there and figure out what I'm saying. But Snowpiercer, that's a great film. Heidi, you can't stay in the chat. Watch later. Thank you, and God bless you too. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you enjoy the. Thank you for tuning in at all. But yeah, you can catch it on the replay. It'll be live as soon as we finish. So enjoy. All right then, let's get into chapter 1. The Lusitania was the largest and fastest ship of her time. She was launched at Clydebank on the 7th of June 1906, an event which moved the shipping correspondent of the Times to such paeans that he jumbled his metaphors. She is, he wrote, a veritable greyhound of the seas, a worthy tribute to her illustrious lineage, a credit to the august and noble stable which conceived her. The Times did not elaborate on her parentage, but adopting its idiom, it may be described as, by naval necessity, out of public funds. The marriage was undoubtedly one of convenience, but paradoxically, it was also a shotgun wedding. The man holding the shotgun was J.P. Morgan, the American financier. Dun, dun, dun. Fancy him showing up. At least it's not a Rothschild. At least we got a different financier in this case. At the beginning of this century, the greater part of the North Atlantic shipping trade was in European hands. The United States, by isolationist and short-sighted legislation, had failed to retain the dominance which, aided by government subsidies, her earlier steamships had gained for her. British, French, and German companies monopolized the traffic, and by their own competition had in many cases reduced their individual profitability to meagre proportions. Since 1897, the two German companies, Hamburg America and Norddeutscher Lloyd, heavily subsidized by their government, had held the blue ribbon for the fastest crossing, and their rivals were finding it difficult to raise the finance to build the ships which would provide effective yet profitable competition. Though the freight, passenger, and emigrant trades were growing fast, fares and rates had been ruthlessly cut in order to obtain a share of the business, and many of the companies were barely able to pay the dividends. J.P. Morgan identified what was, in modern jargon, a classic takeover situation. He resolved to form a combine which would monopolize the North Atlantic sea routes and thereafter adjust the rates to maximize his profits. Yeah, so it's always about monopolizing, isn't it? Corner the market, build a monopoly, and then just squeeze everybody dry. This is why it's so important to try and diversify and have competition, have free market competition, but the monopolies, I don't know if that is an avoidable thing or how it would be avoided, but it always becomes a problem, that's for sure. Pretty astute observation and assessment of J.P. Morgan's kind of tactics and strategies. These financiers, that's what they got to do. They got to corner the market. They've got to force people to use their product, which they can print out of thin air whenever they want. And just enslave the rest of us by doing that. So, up to his old tricks, I would say. By March 1902, Morgan's combine either controlled or held a major shareholding in every substantial shipping company on either side of the Atlantic, with the exception of the Compagnie Generale Transatlantique of France and the Cunard Company of Liverpool. The two great German lines were firmly under Morgan's aegis, and Cunard's greatest English rival, the White Star Line, was finally absorbed in December 1902. Morgan then proceeded to rationalize the shipbuilding programs of the member companies of his combine, now called the International Mercantile Marine Co. By the end of 1902, it was the dominant and most vocal operator in the business, buttressed by a market cap of £25 million. So £25 million in 1902. Whew, that's big money. I wonder what that is by today's standards. Maybe someone could do a quick internet search. £25 million in 1902 versus 2024. Cunard had been negotiating with shipbuilder Swan Hunter for a new fast liner and had almost finalised their plans when the Morgan Combine was announced. Early in 1902, Morgan made a takeover approach to Cunard. Fortunately for them, though it caused apprehension in their Liverpool boardroom, it created consternation at the Admiralty. The Admiralty had for almost 100 years indirectly subsidised the major passenger companies by granting them monies as mail or emigrant subsidies. In return, it had the right to take up suitable vessels for employment as transports or auxiliary cruisers. Now at one swoop, Morgan had deprived their lordships of what was almost a complete auxiliary navy. To the Admiralty, Morgan was then a doubtful quantity, and his connections with the reputed sympathy for German commercial interests made his motive suspect. And we got a little asterisk there, which says, in the event, Morgan was determinedly pro-Ally. During the First World War, he raised loans for the Allies of whatever that massive number is there. It looks like $2,396,797,777 dollars. Sorry, not pounds. Um, yeah, what a good man, loaning all this money out to facilitate the wholesale murder and slaughter and make sure that all the people he was loaning it to were indebted. Such a good patriotic ally supporter there, Morgan. I'm just gonna have a swig, excuse me. Back to the text. At the Admiralty's bidding, Parliament forbade the transfer of the Combine's newly acquired ships from the British Registry. Behind the scenes, the Admiralty generated such pressure on the Treasury for dramatically increased naval estimates and concealed subsidies that the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, remarked, "We are in the face of a jingo hurricane, and driving before it under bare poles." The Admiralty's hand was strengthened by a paper prepared by H.O. Arnold Forster, then Secretary of the Admiralty and a well-known authority on defence. He had recently visited the German bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, and his views were formally accepted as official policy by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Selborne, and embodied in a memorandum to the Cabinet. I am convinced that the great new German navy is being carefully built up from the point of view of a war with us. We cannot safely ignore the malignant hatred of the German people or the manifest design of the German navy. Arnold Forster also reported that the crack German liners were designed from the beginning to operate as armed cruisers, and their potential was such as to constitute a major threat to Britain's maritime supply routes. The outcome was that the Admiralty decided to drop its practice of a modest annual operating allowance and formed a committee to which were invited representatives from the Institute of Naval Architects to help formulate a set of figures which could offer guidance as to how it was to employ its funds in future. The Admiralty requirement was a ship which would achieve a constant 24.5 knots in moderate weather and be capable of mounting a very substantial armament indeed. The committee arrived at its conclusions by taking the mean original costs of ships of varying tonnage and horsepower, together with the previous rates of subsidy, and extending the calculation that the Admiralty specification would need 68,000 horsepower, that the construction costs would be 1.25 million, and that an annual operating subsidy of 204,000 was indicated. At that time, the most powerful ship ever built was the German liner Kaiser Wilhelm II, with engines of 38,000 horsepower, which produced 23.5 knots. In addition, an additional 30,000 horsepower was required to generate the extra knot or so. Armed with this brief, the Admiralty began negotiations with Cunard, which finally resulted in an agreement whereby the Admiralty agreed to finance the whole of the building costs of the two liners, not exceeding a total of £2.6 million at an interest rate of 2.75%, plus an annual operating subsidy of £75,000 per ship, in addition to the mail subsidy. in return for Cunard agreeing to build ships capable of maintaining a minimum average ocean speed of from 24 to 25 knots. The two ships were the Mauretania and the Lusitania. So building them sounds like it was part of this, dick slinging contest between the British Admiralty and the Germans, who were cousins anyway, weren't like the royal families were cousins, I think, at this time. But yeah, kind of like whose ship's bigger. I can build a bigger ship than you. The full terms of the agreement were embodied in two thick volumes which have never been published, as the Admiralty will still not withdraw their security classification. However, they have been briefly described as being as onerous as they were prolix. Oh, that's an interesting word, prolix. You don't see that one very often. I'm not even sure what that means. Maybe verbose, that's my guess. Those relating to the design of the ship have a direct bearing on the enormous loss of life in the ultimate tragedy. The Admiralty stipulated that Cunard should defer on all questions of design and construction, that the ships were to be built to Admiralty specifications and under Admiralty survey, that in the threat of hostilities they were to be withdrawn immediately from service so as to be fully converted to armed cruisers, and that on the outbreak of war they were to be placed under Admiralty command. Cunard were required to guarantee that control of the company would never pass outside British hands, that in time of war they would place their entire fleet at the Admiralty's disposal, and that at all times the crews of the two liners would have a proportion of their officers and men drawn from the Royal Naval Reserve. Cunard accepted all these stipulations, and the formal agreement was signed by them on 30th of July 1903. The design brief which the directors presented to Leonard Peskett, their chief designer, was a formidable one. He had to fulfill the Admiralty specifications without question, and as the company had accepted an annual subsidy of only £75,000 per vessel instead of the indicated £204,000, the balance was to be earned by dramatically increased passenger accommodation. Moreover, Cunard decreed that this accommodation was to be of a spaciousness and splendour hitherto unknown outside the great luxury hotels of the world. Peskett's brief may be summarized as having to devise a floating hotel with accommodation for 2,300 guests and a staff of 900. The whole to cross the Atlantic at more than 24.5 knots and be capable of carrying 12 6-inch guns. The speed of a vessel is determined by a sophisticated equation in which the factors are the horsepower, the waterline length, the beam, and displacement. Peskett already had the specification of 24.5 knots minimum and 68,000 horsepower. He had to fit both his employer's and the Admiralty requirements into a waterline length of 760 feet and a maximum beam of 87 feet 6 inches. This entailed building higher in fact than anyone had ever built a ship before. The early experiments and designs were for a beam of 78 feet, but tank tests at Haslar showed the model to be so dangerously unstable that the beam was increased. The Admiralty also insisted that all engines, boilers, steering gear, fuel and vital controls were to be placed below the waterline, as was the standard practice in warships. Oh, I didn't know that either. That's interesting. The turbine rooms occupied most of the stern section. Then came 4 vast boiler rooms housing 25 boilers which were placed in rows across the ship. The boiler rooms continued up into the taper of the bows, and forward of them were a small baggage hold and the trim tanks. The whole of the vessel was divided into 11 watertight compartments by 10 transverse bulkheads, each fitted with watertight doors. Each boiler room was a separate watertight compartment, but these were too large to give the buoyancy desired, so a longitudinal watertight compartment was fitted down each side of the ship, which completely flanked the boilers and machinery. To prevent collision damage, each of these vast compartments was subdivided into 5 sections. Engines, boilers, and the 2 longitudinal watertight compartments totally filled the space available, and there was no place to store the 6,600 tons of coal needed to drive the ship on one voyage from Liverpool to New York. Of course it would be 66, wouldn't it? To meet the Admiralty specifications, and because no one at the time knew any better, the longitudinal compartments were used to store coal. This was standard Admiralty practice and had been so since 1858. And we've got a little diagram here that we could have a look at. This is like a cross-section. Let's get a bit of zoom on that. Alright, so we got lower orlop deck, lower deck, main deck, upper deck, shelter deck, promenade, and boat deck. Look at that. Just imagine designing and building something like this. That's a scale, you got 100 feet wide, and these will be the, what do you call them? Lifeboats. I don't know where the water line would be here. Maybe that's what that's indicating. So all of that bit is above the water here. Wow, look at that. Just incredible. The foresight, the engineering capability, the knowledge. And what are we building nowadays? Okay. Cole, it was felt, absorbed the enemy's shot and therefore protected the boilers. Oh, let's zoom out a bit more. There we go. No one realized that the mine and the torpedo might have a different effect. In fairness to Pesquet, it must be allowed that no one had ever built boilers and engines of this size before. There is evidence that he realized that there was a risk, but probably not its degree. With the coal stored in the watertight compartments, openings had to be cut into their bases to draw the coal out as required. These apertures were fitted with watertight hatches controlled by the stokers. Anybody who has ever drawn coal from a domestic coal bunker will know the difficulty of closing the hatch, as the weight of coal inside, plus the accumulation of dust and fine scraps of coal, precludes an easy or efficient closure. With the Lusitania's coal bunkers totally destroying the effect of the longitudinal compartments, she lacked both buoyancy and stability. Buoyancy and stability, I think. I mean, I don't know anything about ships and sailing, but I think they're pretty important. Pesquet should have realized this. He had been a designer for Cunard when the Cunarder Oregon sank after a collision off Fire Island, New York, on the 11th of March, 1886. The watertight hatches could not close completely, owing to coal blocking the sills of the hatches, and though her entire compartment was rescued, there was no way of saving her. At the ensuing inquiry, the court ruled that the failure of the watertight bunker hatches to close was the prime factor. The failure of the watertight bunker hatches to close was the prime factor for the loss of the vessel. Okay. So maybe that's why. Oh, so the inquiry into the sinking was that it must have let on water so fast via these watertight bunker hatches, which did not close, that it sank in 18 seconds or whatever it was. Something crazy like that. Was it 18? What was the number? Oh, my memory. I just read it an hour ago and I can't remember how. Was it 18 minutes or something? It was something ridiculously quick, wasn't it? How fast it sank. Anyway. Even assuming that the coal access hatches could and did function perfectly, there was a second risk. Coal absorbs water and therefore increases in weight. Pesquet made a series of calculations of the effect on the ship's stability if the sea entered either 1, 2, or 3 of the coal bunkers on one side. He found that with one bunker hatch open to the sea, the ship would list 7 degrees. It was 18 minutes, thank you, Peter. He found 18 seconds, that would be crazy, wouldn't it? He found that with one bunker hatch open to the sea, the ship would list 7 degrees. With 2 hatches open, she would take a list of at least 15 degrees, and with more than 2 flooded, she was unlikely to float. The master's operating manual advised the captain to abandon ship if at any time she adopted and held a list of more than 22 degrees. By modern standards, this inherent instability would never be acceptable, but there were more compromises to be made. Interesting. So it sounds like the requirements of the Admiralty, that the ship, the things it had to do, meant that the designer had to compromise on the safety, and this contributed to its demise. Pesquet had been forced to build high. On top of what may justifiably be called the power platform, he raised 6 decks. These were designated A to F, reading from top to bottom. The ship's lifeboats were suspended 8 feet above deck A, a total of 68 feet from the waterline. When they were swung out ready for lowering, they cleared the edge of the deck by 18 inches. That's not much, is it? It did not apparently occur to anyone that with even a slight list, it would be impossible to launch the boats on the high side of the ship, short of sliding them down the ship's side. With one coal hatch flooded, or a list of more than 5 degrees, half of the Lusitania's boats were incapable of being launched. That is shoddy design work, isn't it? Less sinister, but equally worrying, was that the boats on the low side would swing outwards from the side, and with the same degree of list, the remaining lifeboats would be hanging 7 feet out from the edge of the deck, with a sheer drop of 60 feet to the water below. This fact apparently escaped Pesquet. He did realize that with one bunker flooded, the sea would enter through the portholes of F deck. Therefore, he caused these to be sealed up, and a set of watertight doors inserted between the boiler rooms and F deck, and again between F and E decks. These could be controlled at the touch of a switch from the bridge. There was a manual override mechanism which the crew below knew how to operate, but there is no record that any passengers were taught the drill, which was their only chance of escaping from what was, to all effects, the third-class coffin. Criticism, with the benefit of hindsight, is doubtless unfair. The Lusitania was in almost every way pushing the horizon of ship design and performance into what was then unknown territory. No word of reproof was ever raised, and the Board of Trade had no hesitation in granting the Lusitania her certificate of seaworthiness. She entered the regular Liverpool to New York service on the 7th of September 1907 and promptly captured the Blue Riband with a new record speed of 25.88 knots. Her size inspired confidence from the start, and short of comparative drawings, it is difficult to describe. The first impression of all contemporary observers was her immense height, which seemed to minimize her length. Laid on her keel alongside the Admiralty who had fathered her, she would have dwarfed the buildings of Whitehall, while passengers on the top deck would see only the pigeons of the Admiralty roof. She was longer and higher than the complete complex of the Capitol and Senate in Washington, and a stroll around the promenade deck was marginally over 1/4 of a mile. This height, length, and distinctive narrowness of beam inspired the description of Greyhound of the Seas, which until 7th of May 1915 no one realized could also be an elegant euphemism for a ship whose beam to length ratio was much like that of a canoe. The Lusitania and the Mauretania monopolized the North Atlantic Seaway, engaged in a friendly rivalry as to which could make the fastest crossing. The Blue Riband appeared to be an intership trophy for the crack liners of the Cunard Company. The first threat to this record came from the Morgan Combine, when the White Star Line announced their own contender, the tragic and allegedly unsinkable Titanic. The world knows that she sank on her maiden voyage after suffering a glancing tear from an iceberg below the waterline. This ripped to gash the length of 3 of her 4 boiler rooms. The Titanic was built with conventional transverse bulkheads, and she remained afloat and on an even keel for almost 3 hours. Formal inquiries into her loss were held in London and New York before the same 2 judges who in due course were to adjudicate upon the loss of the Lusitania. Wow, that is interesting, isn't it? So the Titanic took 3 hours to sink. Formal inquiries into her loss were held in London and New York before the same 2 judges who in due course were to adjudicate upon the loss of the Lusitania. That is so interesting. These what are they called? These commissions that are run to investigate, presidential assassinations or corporate malfeasance, and they get the same people, possibly, maybe people they know will do what they're told, who they've got some dirty on, maybe who they can blackmail or who they've got some agreement with, who they can buy or have some power over. But fascinating that it was the same 2 judges, as he mentioned in the introduction, who were withholding information, or one of them was trying to get it out, wasn't he? One of them was a whistleblower, and the other guy was vetoed for 50 years. But quite incredible parallel there as well. At both the Titanic hearings, counsel for the survivors At both the Titanic hearings, counsel for the survivors compared construction to that of the Lusitania. They alleged that if the Titanic had been constructed with longitudinal bulkheads as were the 2 giant Cunarders, the gash in the side would have been contained and the Titanic would still be afloat. The owners of the Titanic attempted to refute the suggestion. Such bulkheads, they claimed in open court, were of doubtful value as far as buoyancy was concerned, and would lead to such a list that it would have been almost impossible to have launched the lifeboats. The White Star Line did not press this defense too emphatically, as it drew attention to the boats of the Titanic, and on this point they were vulnerable. Both inquiries were to find that the Titanic did not carry sufficient boats to save more than a proportion of her passengers. The plaintiffs, instead of concentrating on the alleged shortcomings of bulkhead design, seized on the emotive and much simpler argument of the boat shortage. The Board of Trade and the Admiralty appreciated the significance of both points. For the first time, the Board of Trade now stipulated just how many boats a passenger liner must carry. It also recommended that liners with a high freeboard should adopt a form of davit which would enable the boats to be swung far out from the ship's side to counteract a severe list. To this recommendation they added a suggestion that as lifeboats had become heavier and were now designed to carry upwards of 60 persons each, a form of geared davit should be employed, as the weight of such boats fully laden would be too much for two men to lower by hand, even with the assistance of a simple arrangement of blocks and pulleys. Cunard promptly doubled the number of boats carried by the Lusitania from 22 to 44. They did not double, nor did they alter the davits. They retained their simple and old-fashioned method of lowering the boats by hand, one seaman at each fall, and the falls passing through a block and pulley. The extra boats were stowed beneath the existing ones, and it would be necessary to lower the first, recover the falls, connect them to the extra boat, hoist it, swing it out, and then lower it to join its fellow. Neither the Board of Trade nor Cunard took the point about the bulkhead design, but it did not escape the Director of Naval Construction, Sir Eustace Tennyson Dencourt. That's a hell of a double-barrel name. Tennyson Dencourt. He initiated a series of reports early in 1914, and all cruisers of this design were subjected to scrutiny. In August 1914, the reports were acted on. Any cruisers or battleships which had unarmoured longitudinal bunkers were on no account to be exposed to submarine attack or to play offensive roles without suitable escorts, and then only on the orders of the Admiralty War Staff. The year 1913 began as a troublesome one for Cunard. To implement the Board of Trade orders meant withdrawing both the Lusitania and her consort for extensive dry docking while the new boats were fitted. In early February, Mr. Alfred Booth, Cunard's chairman, received a letter from Sir William Graham Greene, Permanent Secretary of the Admiralty, which invited him to call to discuss certain modifications to the agreement that existed between the Admiralty and Cunard, and also stated that the Board of Admiralty had decided that it appeared a suitable moment to discuss the company's obligations under the same agreement. Alfred Booth presented himself to the Board of Admiralty at 2:30 on the 19th of February 1913. The First Lord, Winston Churchill, was in the chair, and characteristically he had quite a lot to say. Churchill left Alfred Booth in no doubt that there was shortly to be a war with Germany. The estimated date for its outbreak would be September 1914, when the Germans would have completed their dredging of the Kiel Canal and the European harvest had been gathered. Therefore, he had decided that in the national interest it was the correct time to implement certain of the clauses by which Cunard had agreed to make their ships available to the Admiralty. He expressed a wish that the Lusitania, the Mauretania, the Avernia, and the Aquitania, then under construction, be modified forthwith, so that should hostilities break out, they could without delay take up their role as armed cruisers. He also specified a further 6 ships, including the Transylvania, which were to be converted as soon as the work on the first batch of ships was completed. Booth protested, but the only concession that he managed to obtain was that the Mauretania was to be converted at a different time from the Lusitania so as to enable Cunard to maintain some semblance of their New York service. Under strict secrecy, the Lusitania entered dry dock at Liverpool on the 12th of May 1913. Cunard announced that she was being temporarily withdrawn from service so as to have the latest design of turbines installed, but the New York Tribune gave the game away on the 19th of June when it reported, quote, "The reason why the crack liner Lusitania is so long delayed at Liverpool has been announced to be because her turbine engines are being completely replaced." But Cunard officials acknowledged to the Tribune correspondent today that the Greyhound is being equipped with high-power naval rifles in conformity with England's new policy of arming passenger boats. End quote. The Tribune made one error of fact. Guns or high-powered naval rifles were not actually installed, though orders for them were placed with the Royal Arsenal and they were delivered to Liverpool that November. What actually was done is well documented in the Cunard archives. All the working drawings for the alterations involved are on file at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. The entire length of the vessel between the shelter deck and below the upper deck, a depth of 14 feet and 6 inches, was double-plated and hydraulically riveted. The stringer plate of the shelter deck was also doubled. The reserve coal bunker immediately forward of number 1 boiler room was converted to a magazine. Special shell racking was installed so that the shells rested against the bulkheads, and handling lifts were installed. A second magazine was converted from part of the mail rooms at the stern of the ship, and revolving gun rings were mounted on the forecastle and on the afterdeck so that each deck could mount 2 6-inch quick-firing guns. The teak planking, which composed the floor of the shelter deck, was cut into, and revolving gun rings were installed beneath it. Then the sections of teak deck were replaced, in such a way that the relevant sections could be lifted off like trapdoors. The shelter deck was adapted to take 4 6-inch guns on either side, making a total complement of 12 guns, or a broadside of 6 guns, each firing a shell containing high explosive. A gun ring is like a revolving wheel mounted on ball bearings and sunk flush to the deck. All that was required to complete the fitting of the armament was to lower the gun onto the ring prepared for it, and to secure 12 castellated bolts. The Lusitania returned to the New York service on the 21st of July 1913, and on the 16th of March 1914, a proud Mr. Churchill could announce to the House of Commons that some 40 British merchant ships had been defensively armed. The term defensive in the case of all the Cunarders must be construed as politicians' license, as in each case they could mount a heavier broadside than the Bacchante or E-class cruisers then charged with the defence of the Channel. It was, however, an extremely fortunate choice of adjective, and it must be remembered when the political arguments which followed the loss of the Lusitania are reviewed. War with Germany arrived a month ahead of the Admiralty's forecast, and the Lusitania was about to leave New York when it was declared on the 4th of August 1914. Immediately on her arrival at Liverpool, she was handed over to the Admiralty together with the other Cunarders designated for a cruiser role. By the 8th of August, the Aquitania had had her guns installed, and the Lusitania was moved into the Canada dry dock on Merseyside to be similarly equipped. We've got a asterisk there. The speed with which the armament was installed is evidenced by the actions of the 25,000-ton liner Carmania, which arrived in England on the 6th of August. By the 14th of September, disguised as the German liner Cap Trafalgar and armed with 8 4.7-inch guns, she encountered the Cap Trafalgar, disguised as the Carmania, off the coast of Bahia, Brazil, in the South Atlantic. After a short engagement, the Carmania sank the German ship by holing her longitudinal tanks. The Cap Trafalgar listed heavily and sank by the bow 20 minutes after receiving the Carmania's first salvo. The Admiralty gutted all the passenger accommodation on F-deck, the lowest of the 6 decks above the boiler rooms, and enclosed a large length of the shelter deck. Her armament was installed, and on 17th of September she entered the Admiralty Fleet Register as an armed auxiliary cruiser, and was so entered on the Cunard ledgers. The Lusitania was ready for war. And that is the end of chapter 1. What do you think about that? Now, just as a side note, this footnote here, which was, kind of confusing, but basically this story, I think Colin Simpson, if I'm not mistaken, wrote another book as well about this incident where 2 ships disguised as each other met each other and then had a fight and a battle. Quite an incredible occurrence, really. And what are the odds and the chances of that happening? But yeah, what do you think about chapter 1 there? So it sounds to me like there was every intention to turn this ship into a warship, to make it part of the war. That was how it was funded. That was why it was built to where they cut corners with the design to make it less safe because they needed to do certain speeds and to get up to certain to be able to cover a certain amount of distance and to be the fastest one out there, faster than the German ones. So very interesting. There's quite a lot of terminology there. I don't know how good you are with your nautical terminology, but I didn't know that a list that I suppose that's sort of when a boat is sort of tilting to either side in the water and isn't level, then that's called a list. I didn't know that. I had no idea that that's what that meant. Um, yeah, so quite a lot of a lot of terms there, but very detailed and a lot of footnotes in this chapter. So we'll have a quick look at chapter one footnotes and just sort of um, see what he says. Let me get to the footnotes at the back. Um, I'll get these. I'll get these on the record on the book with the book cam. So these are chapter one notes. So he's referring to a Senate document, and he's given the 66th Congress, the second session. There's a book here, The Life of Sir Michael Hicks Beach, that he's referring to. This footnote 3, I have no idea what that means. It's a lot of letters, PROADM, but it's probably the document that has the quote or the reference. Joseph Chamberlain papers he's referring to, and he gives you the box. So this is incredible, really, because in theory, if this stuff is still there, you could go and access it and have a look at it and check it out for yourself. And that really lends a lot of weight and credence, I think, to the writer, to his discoveries and to what he's writing here, because he's kind of saying, look, you don't have to believe me, you can go and look at it for yourself. So he's referring to a letter in the Cunard archives and the agreement there with the government in the Cunard archives. There's a U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, inquiry into the loss of the screw schooner Oregon. Department of Justice, DOJ, Department of Justice archives. So, yeah, and then the scale plan of the Lusitania. So we've got the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, the box 556 there. So, yeah, I mean, it's great. He's obviously done his homework, and he's gone out there to look at these primary documents to put this book together for us. So, what are your thoughts? I'll take a little look at the comments now. I'm very interested and intrigued in this so far because it seems like it was built from day one with the intention of it being some sort of military vessel. Although I think the mainstream narrative, certainly maybe now with hindsight, with such a distance between the occurrence, they kind of admit more. But I think at the time they were very keen on keeping that aspect of the ship and its development and its building probably hidden and off the radar of the average Joe and Jane reading the newspapers there, right? So let's have a look what we got in the comments. Oh, we got loads here. Okay, I think I've found where we were at. Yeah, Rosemary Smith says, with the internet for information and with no paperwork is frightening. It is, yeah, because it can just be edited and changed and altered at a moment's notice, and what are you going to do about it? Hasdek says, always about the shekels. I guess it's a reference to JP Morgan showing up in the story, I suppose. Cleopatra said she's doing some cooking at the same time. I hope you cooked something delicious and it was tasty. Um, Alien Scientist says, didn't JP Morgan have something to do with the Titanic or Olympic? Pretty sure he got off the ship last minute, leaving 3 men on board who would have opposed the Fed Reserve. Yeah, I've heard something similar about that. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's similar. It's kind of like how a bunch of people didn't show up to work on the September the 11th, when they had offices in the World Trade Center, and they just didn't show up that day. They just decided to stay at home and dial in. Hasdak says he listens to too much Owen Benjamin. Well, that guy is very, very funny. So, Alien Scientist says, pretty sure it was Morgan. Peter Estrada, they still are kissing cousins and mainly of German descent. Yeah, at least on yours end anyway. Windsor is not their real name. Right, it was Saxe Coburg Gotha, was it? And I think have you ever seen a picture of like the Tsar? Is it, I forget the name. It's one of the kings of England and the Tsar of Russia, and they just look like twin brothers. It's very strange. Hasdak says, "Hello Nick, have you come across a book called We? The author was a Russian ship engineer. I will have to go and get his name." No, I haven't. I've heard of the book We, Yevgeny Zamyatin, which is a sort of 1984 dystopian novel. It was written before 1984, and everyone has numbers instead of names, and they all live in glass apartments which are see-through, so you can see what everybody's doing at all times, and there's zero privacy. But it was kind of an early 1984 style book with a similar kind of story arc, with the main guy kind of realizing that society is really shit, and he wants to kind of rebel against it and have a bit of culture and art and love and these kind of things in his life. Uh, yeah, so it was 18 minutes the ship sank, not 18 seconds. Of course, I'm mistaking the time it takes ships to sink with the time it takes skyscrapers to vaporize into their own footprint. Adrian says, so it was loaded with ammo then. I think that's the contention, isn't it? It's sort of shaping up to seem like the ammo might still be there at the bottom of the sea, and they've had to scupper all these attempts to get down there and find out what's in it. Peter says, haven't read, but 20 years ago, less I saw plenty of docos that highlighted what you were saying. Yeah, yeah. So what have we got? Is that another book here? You should check out Charlie Manson's Head Doctor. Is that a song or a book I don't know what that is. Uh, Peter says, of course, the half Yank Churchill. Yeah, I don't know a lot about Churchill, but I do have a bunch of books on his that I'm really looking forward to getting around to reading at some point. I don't know if I'll be able to read them in full. You know, I'm trying to stick to books which are either out of copyright or I've reasonably sure that the author's now dead and passed on, and so it won't cause any like copyright strikes or anything. Because I don't know what the legality is with just reading books straight out into YouTube like this, if I can get in trouble for it. But yeah, that's why I'm kind of focusing on older books for these longer read-throughs, and the kind of 1 hour book reviews will be on more recent books when I get around to doing more of them. Cool. Oh, Zamyatin, yeah, Hasdak was saying. So yeah, Yevgeny Zamyatin. I just had a look. Yes, it's believed 1984 was wrote after Orwell read it. Yeah. Cool. All right. So I hope you enjoyed that introduction and first chapter. You can see how much we got through there. So we've still got quite a bit to go. I reckon we will get quite a few videos out of this. But it's 19, let's see. Yeah, 19 chapters in total. And so if we do maybe 1 or 2 chapters per video. Oh, the next chapter is not that long actually. So we'll just see how we get on. But we're off to a good start, I would say. Quite interesting, a lot of food for thought. And I'm looking forward to finding out what happens, particularly with these 2 judges presiding on the case of both the Titanic and the Lusitania. It'd be really good to know more about them. Who were they linked to and influenced by and working for? I think that would be an interesting thread to pull on. So I'm going to leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much for being here. It's been I was really happy that you all showed up, and I didn't announce this ahead of time because I'm traveling for the rest of the month. Basically, I can't really plan ahead when I'm going to be able to come on to do the videos, so it's going to be kind of more spontaneous when I find a bit of time to jump on and do a little reading for you. So you just have to keep an eye out. I can't really give a solid plan of how long when I'll be able to do these, unfortunately. But that just makes it more exciting, doesn't it? So, with that said, keep an eye out. There's my Telegram group and my Instagram underneath. Best to join the Telegram. I can update that and put links in there when I'm going to go live, and I interact with the people in the chat, and we share book recommendations and good audio lectures and other resources. It's turning into a nice little kind of research group where we're throwing ideas back and forth. So thank you to everyone who's in there already, and that's a good place to stay up to date and find out when I'm going to be live. Otherwise, you're just kind of going to have to get lucky. But it'll probably be around a similar time as I did today, because I'm going to be sort of busy during the day, most every day pretty much. But around this time is when I get a bit of free time, so it'll probably be wherever you are, whatever time it is now, it will be around this time when I do manage to get on and do readings. Okay, so thank you again. Lovely to be here with you all tonight. I hope you enjoyed that little reading. Looking forward to the rest of it, and I will leave it there. So take it easy, look after yourselves and each other, and God bless.